Hey, what's up, guys? Rideshare guy here. And today I'm going to share with you an interview that I recently did on UberMan's YouTube channel. So if you guys haven't checked out UberMan, definitely head over to his channel. I'll leave a link below in the show notes. You can see what he's been up to. He's got tens of thousands of subscribers over there. It talks about a lot of cool rideshare things, personal life, pretty much everything. A lot of good personality over there. So definitely check out his channel. Right now, I actually went on his channel to discuss what's been going on in Austin lately. Christian and I headed to Austin, and we actually talked with a bunch of drivers, talked to a lot of the companies that are there now that Uber and Lyft are gone. And I went on Uberman's channel to basically have him interview me and tell him all about what's going on. So I thought it was a cool interview. He gave me the video, and now I want to share it on my channel too. So hopefully you guys enjoy.
Okay, we're live.
All right.
How's it going, guys? This is Harry Campbell from the Rideshare Guy blog. You can see him at therideshareguy.com. How you doing, Harry?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing your first live hangout. Hopefully we don't screw it up too bad.
It's exciting. It's something I needed to get done anyway, and I appreciate you getting in touch with me to do this.
Awesome. Yeah, I know how to get in touch with you, so you're not a good email guy, but I know how to Facebook you, how to reach you if I need something.
All right. Well, Harry's here today to talk about his recent trip to Austin, Texas. About 3 weeks ago, Uber and Lyft pulled out, and that's left a lot of drivers with no jobs. And Harry went down there to check things out and see what's going on without Uber and Lyft in that area anymore. So without further ado, Harry, tell us about your trip.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, kind of like you said, it's pretty crazy to think because, Austin is this huge rideshare city with millions of people, and they have 10,000 drivers on Uber and Lyft. And when this vote went up to the people, right, and it got voted down, actually, Prop 1, the results came in on a Saturday night or Sunday morning, and then Lyft and Uber were actually gone Monday morning at like 8 a.m. So 10,000 drivers basically no longer had a job.
Wow.
And I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about, right? Just like within 1 day notice. So that was kind of the craziest part for me, just kind of wondering like, all right, what are these drivers doing now that there's no Uber and Lyft, right?
Right.
And kind of what we decided to do was go down there. So Christian and I, who's one of my head writers, we went down to Austin and basically we set up interviews with all of these companies, either an exec or we tried to get a CEO, because now there's actually, I think, 7 or maybe 8 or 9 companies, basically startups, looking to fill the void left by Uber and Lyft. It's been a few weeks since they're gone, so we wanted to go down there, see how passengers are getting around, and also basically see what drivers have been up to, how they've been making money over the past few weeks.
All right. What'd you find out?
So what we found out was that it's not as bad as you might think, right? I mean, definitely in the 2 to 3 weeks after Uber and Lyft left, I mean, we heard some pretty crazy stories. Passengers were kind of obviously like, nobody wants to take a taxi, right? So there's still taxis, but nobody wants to use them. It's kind of like once you get used to Uber and Lyft, you just can't use a taxi, right?
Right.
So that's kind of what we heard from passengers on that side. And on the driver's side, I mean, I guess the thing for me that I thought was pretty messed up about these Uber and Lyft leaving was just that they did it so quickly, right? And drivers didn't have any time to adjust. And so all of a sudden, no one's making any money. And I mean, we heard from one driver who was actually driving to Dallas Thursday through Saturday, and that's 3 hours away. And he was renting an Airbnb and working like 15 hours a day. So that was one driver that we talked to. Another driver we talked to was basically digging ditches, doing day labor because he didn't have a rideshare company that he could work for. And then you had a whole bunch of other drivers who were basically kind of, I mean, I call them like illegal rides, where, they're either going to things like Facebook groups or just existing passengers they knew. And, like obviously it's not the safest or most
Right.
You have no insurance, no licensing, anything like that. But you can imagine there are a lot. Just because Uber and Lyft left doesn't mean that the demand isn't there anymore, right? Passengers still need rides and drivers still need to make money. So drivers were really just doing what they had to do to make money.
So it sounds like all these rideshare companies just kind of popped up and took advantage of a market that was already created and paved by Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely say that. So Get Me, which is a rideshare, they're mainly rideshare, but they also do delivery. And I think you may be familiar with them. They were actually already in Texas. They were already in Houston and Dallas and Austin. And then Wings, which focuses on pre-scheduled airport rides, had also recently launched in Texas. And then they had been planning on launching in Texas. It wasn't because of this vote. So those were the two companies that were already there when Uber and Lyft left. But I think I saw that Get Me said they had like 500 or 1,000 drivers. And Wings maybe had a few hundred because they only do airport rides, but there were 2,000 drivers who needed jobs. So obviously those companies weren't nearly enough to fill the gap. And that's why we saw companies like Fasten. Fasten is in Boston, and so they just launched in Austin. Fair is in Phoenix, and they just launched in Austin, moved their headquarters there. And then a couple others like InstaRide and, then obviously Arcade City, which I kind of joke, but it's really just basically a Facebook group.
Right.
What people were doing to get rides. So quite a few competitors now.
Well, from talking to the drivers down there, I mean, are they doing better now that all of these new rideshare companies are popping up, or is everybody still struggling for business?
I mean, I definitely wouldn't say that they're doing better right now, but I say things are kind of looking up. I mean, most drivers that we talked to, like the 2 to 3 weeks after Uber and Lyft left, were pretty rough. I think for the drivers who kind of, honestly, the drivers who are really prepared, like who are already signed up with Get Me and who are already signed up with Wings and had already sort of built up a little bit of a private client network, those drivers actually ended up making more when Uber and Lyft left, just because there were so many airport rides, there's so much demand on Get Me, and then everyone needed a ride. So the drivers who kind of saw it coming, which were very, very few drivers, I would say. I mean, we only talked to a handful of drivers, 2, 3 drivers who were really prepared. They actually did better, but on average, the majority of drivers really kind of struggled in those 2 to 3 weeks after. And now I'd say things are sort of starting, not getting back to normal, but drivers are starting to see that, hey, we have a few options. There's some passengers starting to use Fasten. There's some bugs with the Fare app, but it gets the job done. Get Me, drivers are complaining about the UI and the interface, but they're getting rides. So I'd say it's kind of like they're making it work.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. This is one of the things that really concerns me. I'm gonna have to do a video about this in the near future because I think a lot of people just have been taking Uber and Lyft for granted. It's just something that it's been there for quite a while, and people just assume that they're going to wake up every day and it's still going to be there. But in reality, Uber and Lyft, this whole ride-sharing industry, this is still new. It's in its infant stages. I mean, there are a lot of laws and regulations that are going to be placed on these companies in the future. And it seems like Uber and Lyft, if they don't get their way, they just leave. And I mean, from a business standpoint, maybe that makes sense to them, but I feel like they should have some kind of an obligation to their drivers as well. And it looks like they're just willing to drop everybody and walk away.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess for me, that was kind of the thing that I really wanted to go on the ground and talk to drivers and see kind of what they thought about that. I mean, you can imagine a lot of drivers are going to be pissed, right? A lot of drivers aren't going to be happy because they don't have that income source anymore. And I guess for me, you sort of, what's interesting is that Uber and Lyft are really working hand in hand with a lot of these regulation issues. And these are two companies that don't like each other, right? That's putting it mildly. You've done a bunch of good videos on like stuff in the past, and they've sort of cooled down since. But I mean, they used to send, Uber used to send drivers into Lyft vehicles to recruit them and offer them $1, right? Operation Uber Slog, right? Is what they called it. And so, I mean, they did crazy stuff like that. So these companies aren't exactly best friends, but now obviously they both pulled out at the exact same time, so they were talking to each other. And I mean, I guess you kind of expect Uber to do something like that overnight, to pull out and say, hey, if we don't get our way, we're going to leave. But I was really surprised that Lyft actually pulled out, because typically a lot of drivers, they think that Lyft is a little bit more driver friendly, and you may not get as many rides, and that's kind of the big complaint from drivers for Lyft, that they don't get enough rides with Lyft. But it seems like they care more about their drivers. So I just thought it was a really not a Lyft type of move to kind of pull out with a one-day notice because Uber did.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that seems to be the general consensus, is that Lyft cares about their drivers. If you look in a lot of markets, Lyft may not be much more than Uber, but down here it's like a few cents. It's something.
I mean, the prices are one thing, but obviously they have the tipping option. They have the power driver bonus that gets you part of your commission back or all of your commission back. Even small stuff like if you rate a passenger 3 or below on Lyft, you'll never get matched with them again, right? They don't have features like that on Uber.
Right.
I think it's a lot of those small things that add up and kind of show that Lyft, they actually sort of care about their drivers and really want those. They may not be able to offer $2 a mile in every city, but they can do a lot of these little things to help drivers. So that's why I was surprised in Austin for sure.
Well, what do you think the chances are of Uber and Lyft coming back to Austin?
I mean, I don't see any way they can come back at least for 2 to 3 months, right? They made this big kind of, this big stance that, hey, we can't do fingerprints, we're going to leave. And they pulled out and they did it, right? I mean, to their credit, they lived up to their word. I think a lot of people in Austin, I think you and I probably were pretty sure that they were going to pull out, but I think a lot of citizens, a lot of drivers, we even talked to members of city council in Austin, they were surprised that Uber and Lyft left. So I think that right now, and at least in the next 2 to 3 months, Uber and Lyft really can't come back because they would just look like idiots if they did, right? It's one thing leaving, but then kind of leaving and coming right back, I think would make them look bad. But at the same time, the city council, they were the ones kind of pushing for these fingerprint regulations, and they won the vote. Right, regardless of whether there are lots of things that said, oh, the people who actually use Uber and Lyft didn't vote. I mean, regardless of what you say, you can't really argue with the math, right? The vote said that the citizens who voted at least want fingerprints, right? So you kind of have to listen to that if you're city council. And I think that for the next 2 to 3 months, city council, they're from their perspective, look, there's 9 companies now in Austin that are trying to fill this gap. Why should they have to cave, or why should they even have to compromise with Uber and Lyft? They're kind of in the position of power right now, right? They're kind of see, hey, okay, if in 3 months all these companies suck and no one can get a ride, then they might start feeling some pressure. But I think for now, there's really no room to compromise on either side. So I'd say that, I mean, in the short term, I can't see Uber and Lyft coming back. But, once these big events like University of Texas football, I mean, you're out there in Oklahoma City, so you know how big college football is. How many people come into Austin for these games, hundreds of thousands of people. That's when it's going to be kind of the real test. Like, hey, are people starting to miss Uber and Lyft? When South by Southwest, which is this huge tech festival, comes to Austin, are people going to be, wondering, hey, where are Uber and Lyft? That's when I think, there's going to be both pressure on both sides to see if they can come back.
Okay, Chicago. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I mean, I think that was probably one of the reasons, just relating it to Austin. I mean, that's why Uber and Lyft are making such a big deal, because if, they give in Austin, what's to say, the Chicago aldermen look at this and say, hey, well, Uber and Lyft just gave into fingerprints in Austin. Now we can do that. So I think the big thing in Chicago for Uber and Lyft is they really, they're starting to, it's a little bit slippery slope though, right? Because they can't just keep pulling out of all these markets. Because Chicago, right? I don't know if you want to pull out. I mean, they might threaten Chicago, but hey, if they pull out of Chicago, there's going to be plenty of companies willing to go to Chicago and start up there too. That's an even bigger market than Austin, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure if Uber is willing to play that card, or Lyft. That's a big market. That's a huge market, and they would definitely feel a sting from pulling out of Chicago. But it's hard to predict what they're going to do, I
mean, I think they're kind of at a turning point right now, because they can't just keep pulling out of they can pull out of 1 or 2 markets and kind of say, hey, look, we were right. But they can't pull out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 markets. And they're actually going to start losing a lot of money and a lot of passengers and maybe even market share if companies like Fasten and, Ride Austin or whatever local options start popping up. I mean, one thing I'll tell you is getting around in Austin with Fasten, which is the company out of Boston. They've been around for 7 months. I mean, they have a legit app. Their app works real well on the drivers and passenger side. It looks just like Uber. It works just like Uber. I mean, by the end of the trip, we kind of both found ourselves defaulting to Fasten. Even when I got back to California, I clicked the Fasten app and I was like, oh wait, I'm back in California. I got to call an Uber, right?
What's the pricing with Fasten compared to Uber and Lyft?
So Fasten was actually at 95 cents a mile, which is pretty low, and they raised it. Drivers were complaining about that. Drivers were complaining that the rates were too low on Fasten, and they actually raised it up to 115 a mile, which is still, lower on the broad spectrum of things, but it's higher than Uber was in Austin at the time. I think Uber was just under $1 a mile in Austin. So, the pricing I think is going to be around Uber or maybe even a little bit higher. And but to start, I think a lot of these passengers and drivers are just happy to have an option in general. So passing, the pricing isn't as important to start at least.
Well, that's awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it, because that sounded like a really interesting trip. And I may have to take your lead on that and go down there and check things out for myself. hopefully without running into anybody from Arcade City.
Worst case scenario, if it does get banned in another place, like, or if they pull out of Chicago or somewhere like that, maybe you and I will make a trip together and we'll.
I'd go to Chicago. Absolutely, we could do that.
So yeah.
All right, well, guys, that's Harry Campbell. Check out his blog at therideshareguy.com. Lots of useful information, tips and tricks on there that'll keep you profitable. Harry, I appreciate your time, man. Thanks for taking the time to come on here and talk with us.
Cool. Thanks for having me on. Take care.
All right, have a good one.